7 years after the Inquisition banned Copernicus, news reached Galileo that a new pope had ascended the throne of St. Peter. The College of Cardinals had chosen a member of a prominent Tuscan family, a man Galileo actually considered a friend. Maffeo Barberini would become Pope Urban VIII.
Urban VIII is an interesting choice for a pope at that point. He's a member of the Barberini family, and the old joke was what the barbarians didn't loot from Rome, the Barbarinis did.
His coat of arms, when he was a young prelate, had 3 horseflies, and horseflies became increasingly undignified for someone who's rising that far in the church. And so the horseflies at a certain point change into busy bees, and Maffeo Barberini therefore becomes the personification of a hardworking, productive individual.
Everything that you see that is a sign of the beautiful Renaissance Rome was either started, continued, or inspired by what Urban VIII had done.
At the bottom of the Via Veneto, you have a fountain with 3 Barberini bees, reminding you which pope gave you this water fountain, and also reminding you that you shouldn't be just lounging around at the fountain. You should be making like the bee and producing honey.
The new pope was a great fan of Galileo, who had written poems to Galileo, and all of a sudden then the situation appeared very different from the way it did in 1616.
When news of Urban VIII's elevation reached her convent, Maria Celeste hoped that her father's silencing at the hands of the church would be over. Galileo secretly shared a letter he received from his old friend, the Pope.
Father, the happiness I derived from the letter written to you by the Supreme Pontiff was indescribable. His note so clearly expresses the affection this great man has for you. I have read and reread it, savoring it in private. And here I return it to you as you insist, without having shown it to anyone.
Galileo made the difficult 2-week journey to Rome, especially to meet with Pope Urban VIII. The 2 old friends had a series of conversations as they strolled the paths of the Vatican.
The Pope and Galileo walked around in the Vatican gardens talking about various things, and of course one of the things they talked about was whether or not Galileo could publish on the Copernican theory. And the Pope told him that as long as he limited himself to speaking about it hypothetically, there would be no problem.
So as long as the Copernican view that the Earth moved around the Sun was presented only as a hypothesis, one theory among many, Urban VIII would allow it to be debated.
Galileo came away from these meetings feeling that this was the time to write his big book on cosmology, which he had been promising since 1610.
Now 60 years old, he threw himself into his new book. The Pope had given Galileo license to embark on what he hoped would be his most important work. Writing in Italian, not Latin, laying out his most persuasive evidence in a witty popular style, Galileo set out to entertain and win over everyone who read it to the Copernican worldview. Maria Celeste's letters suggest that her father permitted her to read his unfinished manuscript.
There seems to be a genuine interest on her part in his work. Of course, she's self-denigrating. She always says, I'd love to see what you're writing if you think I could understand it. And of course, I'll promise not to talk about it to anyone else. So they have an intimacy on the work level. And possibly the most interesting thing that comes out of the letters is this strong indication that when he's working on the dialogue, their back and forth starts to include something called cuttings, which are obviously pieces of a manuscript. And it seems that she is the one who's actually preparing the manuscript.
Months of writing stretched on as sickness interrupted his work. Finally, after 5 years, the end was in sight.
By the grace of God, I've got on the right path. The book will be quite large and full of novelties, which, by writing it in the manner of a dialogue, I can introduce without affectation or drudgery. If I can just survive this winter, I shall bring it to an end and publish it immediately.
Galileo finished his great book on Christmas Eve 1629. It was called Dialogue on the Two Chief Systems of the World.
It is a rhetorical masterpiece. Galileo explains the new view of the world. It is a debate about the world systems. Is the sun the center of the universe? Or is the earth the center of the universe? He brings forward all his wonderful discoveries with the telescope, and you're just pulled along by this narrative.
Galileo creates 3 spirited characters, noblemen of Venice. The first character, the host, prompts a debate between his 2 talkative guests. One of the visitors clearly speaks up for Copernicus and Galileo, but the other guest, Simplicio, the simpleton, is a comic foil, mouthing the Church's doctrines on science and philosophy. Galileo got permission from a friendly censor to publish his book in Florence. He knew the censors in Rome would be much more difficult to persuade. He dispatched a handful of copies to the Vatican. But before he could hear the result, Florence was hit with a terrible catastrophe. In 1630, the bubonic plague struck all of Tuscany. In a matter of weeks, 6,000 Florentines were dead, and Galileo lost touch with Rome. Every night, as the city cowered behind barred doors, carts would collect the bodies. Physicians wandered the streets in masks, stuffed with straw to protect them from contagion.
An outbreak of bubonic plague strikes all of Italy, strikes badly in Tuscany, and because of the development of science, there's some idea that there's contagion involved. And so there are attempts by the Grand Duchy of Tuscany, which is a pretty centralized governmental system, to establish quarantines, often in terms that we'd find inhuman, sealing up people's houses.
Chiudi questa casa, non c'è più niente da fare.
The rulers of Tuscany couldn't decide whether to rely on quarantine or on the power of prayer. Just to be certain, they tried both.
Parading the Madonna of Impruneta around the city is a way of invoking her divine aid. And of course, having a religious procession somewhat militates against the effect of quarantine. You hope that faith will override what looks like the law of nature.
The Magistry of Public Health enlisted the help of Maria Celeste's convent.
Praying for the rest of the world really had importance, and the nuns knew that. And in fact, during the plague, they were specifically commissioned to pray 2 at a time for 40 days, round the clock. And that was considered one of the most active interventions that could be made against the plague.